Hey folks, Paul here, and in today's video we're going to be taking a look at my top 5 beginner bushcraft firelighting methods. Now I say these are beginner, but I've been using these pretty much since I started, probably about 8 years ago, and regardless of where I am in the country or the weather conditions, it's normally one of these 5 techniques I'm using to get my fire going. So I hope you enjoy this video and let's get stuck in. Okay, so before we get started collecting our different materials that we're going to be trying out today, I figured we would just briefly cover what it is that most people use when they are beginning bushcraft and will normally continue to use throughout their bushcraft career, if you like, or their as their interest in the hobby continues. It's the method that most people will go to, and it's called a Ferrocerium rod. Some people call them flint and steels, some people call them spark rods, you name it. They have all number of names, but you've probably seen them before on survival TV and all that sort of stuff. But essentially what it is a composite metal, and I believe it contains magnesium and ferrocerium. I'm sure there's probably some other things in there, but they're very, very common when it comes to bushcraft. It's the thing most people tend to use. Now, you often get two types. You get the nice decorative ones that are small and dainty and will sit next to your knife on a sheath or something. And then you get the big, chunky, robust things. This is what I've been using for probably the better part of 5 years now. No handle, no nothing, no frills, just a straight ferrocerium rod. Now the reason I bring this up is because although these small little ones are nice, these bigger ones are much more functional. You could put a handle on this and make it nice, but for me it's a functional tool and I'm not too worried about it. But from a functionality point of view, the ferrocerium rod, the bigger one, gives you much more surface area to scrape, and that gives you more sparks, and more sparks gives you more chance of getting a spark in the right place to catch whatever it is you're trying to light on fire. So you can just go down to one of these small ones if you refine your skill enough, and that's not a problem. But even now, 8 years on, the big ones are still far, far superior in my opinion. These ferro rods often come with strikers, and the strikers are quite often attached. If they're bought from a shop, they're quite often attached by a little cord, and you scrape it and they produce sparks. I would suggest if you have one that has a scraper attached to it that you take that off, so you can use it freely. If it's on a string and you're trying to use it, then you've got limited mobility and it's just a bit frustrating. But better than that still is to use a knife. So a lot of knives these days, Mora are quite good at it, have what's known as a 90-degree spine. Now that's useful for a lot of things, but it works really well for scraping ferro rods and producing sparks. Essentially what you want is a nice sharp edge or a hard edge that's going to scrape material off of this ferro rod and produce sparks. But knives quite often have 90-degree spines and they can be used. And the reason I might prefer a knife over one of those little strikers is because it basically limits the amount of stuff you're having to carry. So I can get rid of the striker and I can just carry my knife, and that works perfectly fine. So there's a few different techniques for using these. Let's delve into our first fire lighting technique and we'll cover some of the methods for using them. Okay, so the first tinder we're going to be taking a look at is what I would consider to be probably the best beginner tinder. Where I grew up, I didn't have access to any trees, so I didn't have access to the materials that we're going to cover later on in this video, like birch bark and fatwood. But what I did have was lots of grass, and grass is really good for a beginner because it's very simple to identify and process, and you don't really need to do anything to it. There's two main things to look out for, and that's to make sure that the grass is really dead, very easily indicated by the straw yellow colour, and the other thing to make sure of is that when you collect it, it's nice and dry. So typically what I would do is I kind of grab the tops and break the grass from there, and then just start building a pile that way. The reason I do it this way is because what tends to happen is you can pull out all of the grass, and if you pull out the roots are still going to have moisture in them, and so that's going to be a bit of a hindrance when it comes to trying to get the material to light. But when it comes to collecting it, you've just got to trust your senses. Use your hands, feel all the grass. It's nice and dry, you don't have any problems. And you don't need a lot of it to make a good fire. Probably about that much there would be enough to get a decent fire going. So grass is my #1 choice. It's readily available. You'll find it on the edge of fields, on fences and that sort of thing. You'll find it in clearings, in woodlands like this. You'll also find it on the overhangs of verges and cliffs and that sort of thing as well. So readily available just about everywhere. Really no processing, and very, very reliable as well. So let's go and take this over to our stump and have a look at how we would get it to light. Okay, so before we move on to actually lighting our grass, let's take a quick look at how we use the Ferrocerium rods. Now, like I say, I use my knife as a striker, and I would strongly suggest that if you're going to look into using this as a fire lighting method, you guys do the same. There's two different techniques that you'll quite often see taught. The first one, we'll use the smaller one because this is the ferro rod most people will go for. The first one involves holding your striker, so my knife in this case, still, and then with the ferro rod in this hand, you pull it back, and the idea is that the knife stays still and only the ferro rod moves. And what happens is you're then directing sparks down into this area. Now, there's nothing wrong with that technique. It's the technique that most people will try as they start out. But for me, it's not the preferred technique. As you saw there, the sparks kind of tend to cover a huge area, and I find that to be sort of counterproductive when it comes to trying to get something to light. Especially if you're working with marginal materials on a wet day. You don't want to be sort of showering sparks everywhere. You want them to be really concentrated. And there is a technique that allows us to do that, and it's the technique I use 100% of the time. I don't think I've ever actually used this technique with any real purpose. The technique I use is we take our ferro rod, we place it down onto something hard. Now, I've got a stump here. It doesn't have to be a stump, it could be like a little piece of bark like this that's lying around. Just sit that on the ground, and then that gives you something hard to put your ferro rod onto. And the idea is that you would take your tinder, so let's say grass in this case, you would place it onto something hard. You would use your ferro rod to then hold down the material, and then you would strike down. So without the grass, I'll show you how that looks. Okay. So you can see I'm kind of working in a smaller area. They're not going right over the edge here. It's a little bit windy, so they're being blown around a lot. But typically the sparks will develop underneath the blade of my knife here. So the blade of my knife will act as a shelter for them. But it also just keeps it nice and controlled. So all that being said, let's take a look at our grass. Now, like I say, grass is beautiful in that it's really easy to process. This is the stuff we've just collected, and all you have to do to process this to make it ready to take a spark is just rough it up with your hands. Now, depending on the grass, you'll need to spend sort of longer or shorter a time roughing it up. Some grasses are finer than others, some are more coarse. So don't worry about kind of all these little bits blowing away. The great thing about grass is it's such a readily available resource, you don't need to worry about that at all. Collect it all up into a nice little bundle, and you can hopefully be able to see there that we've got a mixture of nice, really small fibres like these ones here, and we've got a mixture of really coarse stuff. And the idea is that we can just drop a spark into that and it will start to burn. Okay, so I'm going to place it down like we talked about. Take my ferro rod, use that to hold that down. Like I say, it's a windy day today and you can see the grass taking off on me here, so another benefit to this technique where you're holding the material down, and then with your knife scrape down into it, and there you go, you can see the fire there. Really simple, really easy, and again really reliable, you know, and that's the thing that's the most important when it comes to firelighting, being able to do it reliably, and grass is really good for that. I'm going to put this out before the wind takes it all away. You can hear it roaring there, you can hear just how hot it gets as well. Make sure that's all out. So grass, absolutely fantastic stuff, and one of the things I would really strongly recommend that people get to grips with. Once more, just for good measure, hold it down, strike into it, and there you go, fire straight away. Okay, so method 2 for our fire lighting is this. Now, some of you guys may be familiar with this. This is sort of the king of fire lighting when it comes to bushcraft. This is what's known as a birch tree, and the bark of the birch tree is full of oils, and these oils burn really readily. And birch bark is very giving of its bark. It doesn't take much to collect it, and you don't do much, if any, damage to the tree at all by collecting this stuff. So really useful stuff to use, and because this bark is full of oils, it's also quite waterproof as well. Birch bark is often one of the few materials you can use when it's been raining, and because of the oils in the bark, the water won't permeate into it. It will just sort of run off. The outside may get wet, but once you start working your way to the inside, then you've got dry material, and the oils in it mean that it'll take a spark and burn really hot and for quite a long time as well. This is probably the staple. This is the one that most people use, and for very good reason. So let's take a quick look at how we collect the bark off of this. Okay, so you can see here, as the tree grows, it tends to shed its bark. Sort of the bark seems to grow in layers. Now, I'm not by any means a tree expert of any kind, but what happens is, as the tree gets bigger, it seems to shed its outer bark as it grows new bark underneath, and where it does that, you can see it leaves the bark sort of peeling up here. That makes the bark really easy for us to collect, and all you have to do is just grab a piece and pull it off. Do that a couple of times until you've got a decent pile. And you can see we're not breaking into the inner bark of the tree here. This is still the outer, and you can see the red in here as well, very indicative of the oils in the tree. Okay, so you can see I've got myself another stump here, and here's the bark we just collected. Now again, exactly the same process. You want to rough it up in your hands. The longer you take to do this, the finer the pieces you're going to have. The finer the pieces you have, the easier they're going to catch a spark. The smaller it is, the easier it's going to go on fire, basically. You can see all this dust here gathering underneath. Try and keep hold of that if you can. And then all we need is our knife and our ferro rod. Now, you'll still have some big pieces in here like this. These will be really good for when it actually gets going. But we want to look for the smaller stuff in the pile here. That's where we want to put our sparks into. We don't want to try and light the big stuff, we want to try and light the small stuff. And again, you can take some of these shavings and just put them on top, and that'll help your chances as well. Again, using the technique where the ferro rod sits on top, and then using the knife to strike down into the birch bark, and hopefully it will catch. There we go. And then just gently guide that flame to light all the other pieces, and before you know it, you'll have a nice big fire in no time. And hopefully you'll be able to see it here, but there's quite a lot of black smoke coming off of this. Again, that's just those oils burning off. A few of the materials that we use that have oils in them, or resins, will produce that sort of black smoke, and again, very good indicator that it's a choice material. So if grass isn't available, birch bark is definitely your second best choice. Okay, so the next material we're going to be taking a look at, option number 3 in my books, is what's known as fatwood. Fatwood, again, another one of those great materials because it's waterproof, very easy to obtain, and lasts a long time as well. And we get fatwood from the trees that you see around me here. These are Scots pine, or Caledonian pine as they're sometimes referred to. Very easy to identify, nice scaly bark. And we have these pretty much all over the UK, but very common sort of worldwide, and just about any pine will produce good fatwood, as well as some spruces and some larches, but I find that pine, in particular Scots pine, tends to produce the best fatwood. Now, what fatwood is essentially the resin of the tree being concentrated into a place where it's nice and dense. As this tree is living now, it's got resin kind of flowing up and down the tree, and it will use those resins to heal any damage in the tree. So if I were to come along with my knife, for instance, and stick a big hole in the side of this tree, what it would do is use the resin to fill in that hole and stop any insects from getting out. The resin sort of has a lot of healing properties as well. If you were to go around and collect the resin from the tree, they could be used as a sort of cream for antiseptic and antibacterial properties on a cut. It can even be used to hold cuts closed as well, but that's not what we're going to be using it today for, I hope. What we need to find is a Scots pine tree that has come down and died some time ago, and luckily enough for me, we have one just behind us here. Okay, so here's the tree I was just telling you about. Again, this is a Scots pine, but this one has come down in a storm, or maybe it's been cut down. I think this one, yeah, so this one is blown down in a storm, and these are the sorts of trees we're looking for. We want the ones that are dead. If they're living, the resin is still flowing through them and it's no use. The reason for that is the needles of these trees have resin in them, and the resin's flowing through the branches, and what we want is that resin to collect somewhere so that it's nice and dense and that it's not being moved around anymore, so that we can collect it. And for me, the best place to find that is in these branches here. So if you look at this branch here, for instance, that branch once had a lot of needles up at the top of it, and of course resin is flowing through it. The tree has since died, but it's died pointing straight up. The resin is a liquid, so it's going to settle all the way down to the bottom, and it's going to be concentrated in all these little shoulders here. So where the branch joins the tree and you've got a shoulder, the resin is going to be concentrated in all those little places, and so that's where we're going to get our fatwood from. Now, just to be clear, fatwood, as it's known, is just pine wood that's been saturated with resin. The resin has settled out as the tree has died, and that's all it is. There's nothing special to it. Again, this can refer to any wood that's full of resin that can be used this way. So all we need to do is just saw off one of these little branches, and we should be able to tell very quickly if it has resin in it. So for this I'm going to need my folding saw. You could, if you were in a sort of survival situation, hack away at them with a knife, or you could batten into them to break them off. But a saw is the easiest way to collect this. And essentially, let's say this is our tree trunk, the branches are coming down. We want to cut off the branches as close to the tree trunk as we can get, because that's where the resin is going to be sitting, so that's where we want to get to. So again, as close as I can possibly get to the trunk. Okay, so here's the tree we've just cut, and the biggest indicator for knowing whether or not you found fatwood is the smell. As I was cutting this and making all these shavings, I could smell straight away this very strong pine smell. That is the resin in the wood being exposed to the air through the little shavings that we make as we're cutting it. The other really obvious telltale, and it's not too obvious in this lighting unfortunately, but the colour of the wood is very different. As opposed to being this white colour that pine normally is, this is a very sort of deep reds. There's some deep reds in there, you can see it in that ring there particularly, and it's very hard as well. So we'll take this piece over to our stump and we'll talk about how we process it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove just about 3 or 4 inches of this wood. I don't need the whole branch, I just need these bottom 3 or 4 inches. So I'm just going to cut this here and then take it over to our stump. Okay, so here is our piece of wood that we've just cut, and all we need to do to process this is to remove some of this outer bark. That will help us confirm that we do have fat wood in here, and then we'll be pretty much ready to use it. So just nice and carefully remove all the outer bark. Okay, so once you've removed all the bark, you should be able to see some of the colours in there where the resin is more densely packed. This isn't the greatest piece of fatwood I've ever seen. Sometimes you'll find this where the wood is actually a really deep red, or almost translucent. It's got that much liquid in it. But regardless, this piece still smells really strongly, and I can see there's resin in there, so we'll give it a shot. So when it comes to using fatwood, the process is fairly simple. All we need to do is just use our knife, and I like to use the blade, but if you've got a 90-degree spine you can use that as well. And you're just going to start scraping the wood and making some shavings. You can see there we're just getting a little pile of shavings. Like I say, I tend to like the blade of the knife. It will dull your knife doing it this way, but I find the shavings come off a bit easier. And all we need to do is just make a good pile of those. And of course, the bigger the pile of shavings you have, the more likely you are to hit it with a spark and get it to go on fire. But also the more likely you are to actually procure fire regardless, because you're going to have more material, it's going to be hotter fire. So it's always better to have more when it comes to fire making, but for this sake, that will be enough there. Shouldn't need much more than that really. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our knife and we're going to just make some bigger shavings. Just sort of like that. Now the idea behind this is that when we get those smaller shavings to go, they'll burn for a wee while, but not quite as long as we want. So having these slightly larger shavings, we can put them on top and they'll begin to burn too. And that way we can dramatically increase the amount of time we have to get our kindling on top, and again, just increasing our odds of successful fire. So all we have to do is take our ferro rod again, place it in the middle and strike down into it. And there we go. And again, taking these little shavings and just chucking them on there, trying to get them to go as well. It smells like bubble gum, this stuff, when it's burning, which is nice. And there you go. So from there, you would let it build up, and then you'd start putting your kindling on top of that. So that's Fatwood again, very easy. Another one of those waterproof options, and again, readily available. Takes a little bit more processing, but worth its weight in gold, I'd say. Okay, so let's move on to method number 4, and this one is what's known as feather sticks. These are very, very popular in the bushcraft community, and rightfully so. They have a very good place when it comes to fire lighting. They're very reliable, but they're not in my top 3 because they require just a little bit more work than on a wet day, which is normally what they're designed for. They are just a bit too much faffing really for my liking, but that's an entirely separate video, and we'll tackle that another day. What I'm looking for is a nice soft wood, so I've got another piece of pine here. It's fallen, but it's not quite touching the ground, so it's not going to be rotten. It still have nice fresh wood in here. I'm looking for a nice straight piece, and I'm looking for a nice long piece, preferably about the length of my forearm, so that I can get a nice good curl. For those of you that know what feather sticks is, you'll know what I'm referring to. But again, soft wood, nice and straight, and off the ground ideally. When it comes to fire lighting and we're looking for dry materials, off the ground is always kind of what you're looking for. So again, not much needed to harvest this, just the saw. There we have it. So just about that, like I say, about the length of my forearm, just as a rule of thumb, and nice and fresh, healthy, living. And let's take this over to our stump, and I'll show you how we turn this into a feather stick. Okay, so again, with this, what we're going to want to do is just remove the outer bark, and this is just because we want to get a nice flat surface to start making our feathers off of. So just remove all the outer bark, and of course the outer bark tends to be where most of the moisture is. And you want to try and make all these cuts in as long and as smooth and as neatly as possible. That'll become quite important later on. Okay, so all the bark has been removed, and again, the bark will hold a lot of the moisture, so we want to remove that as quickly as possible. Now this is actually probably a bit big for one feather stick. It's a bit bigger than the diameter of my thumb. I reckon we could probably squeeze 2 out of that. So I'm going to split this, and hopefully we'll be able to get 2 out of this instead of just 1. Okay, so you can see we just finished splitting it there. You'll notice it didn't split very cleanly. It's got a nice twist in it, which is quite cool. That doesn't really affect us too much when it comes to making our feather sticks. What I'm looking for is something that's fairly thin and has these nice sharp edges on it. So where I split it, I've got these nice sharp edges. Now, you'll see why that's important in a minute. Let me bring you guys in a bit closer and we'll get to making our feather sticks. Okay, so it's quite important you have a nice stump underneath you for this one, just to make it a bit easier. There are ways you can do this without having a stump or something, but I find it makes life just much easier. So a feather stick is essentially a collection of shavings on one stick, and the way we make those shavings is we have a nice sharp edge like this from where we've split our wood. And what we're trying to do is use our knife and run it the length of the piece of wood and create these little shavings. Like that. Okay, so we just need a big bundle of those basically. But of course, every time you take a shaving off that point, the point then gets divided into 2. So if I'm taking the point off of this, then I'm flattening it out and then I've got 2 points on either side. So then, instead of going back down the middle, the bit I've just cut off, I'll move to this side and then sort of go down that point. Now, what's dictating the size of my curls here is the amount of wood I'm trying to take off, which I'm adjusting by the pressure I'm putting on the knife. So the less pressure, so this would be less pressure, the smaller the shaving. Absolutely tiny. Hopefully you can see that one there. Tiny shavings. Whereas if I put more pressure, like I have been doing with these bigger ones, I'll get bigger shavings like this. Now what I'm looking to do is do some nice big shavings up top and then some smaller shavings down the bottom, and that will help us in lighting the feather stick when we come to make our fire. Now you'll see I'm almost exclusively working on one side. When I feel like I've got enough on this side, what I'll do is I'll start to turn the piece and I'll start carving this side, and then that way we'll have a big bundle of feathers we can light. So I think I'm pretty much done on that side, so what I'll do is I'll turn it over and I'll start on this side. Okay, and you can see it starts to kind of widen out there. So you can spend a long time making these very pretty and have nice big fancy curls, and admittedly this isn't something I practice a lot of the time, so this is actually a mediocre example at best, but it'll give you some idea of how they work. And it requires a lot of the sharpness of your knife and good technique as well, which, like I say, I probably am the best at demonstrating this, but I can do it to the point where they're proficient for working. So you can see I've got a decent head of feathers on there. My next step is to start making some really fine feathers in here, and they're going to be the ones that are going to catch the spark when we come to light it. So I'm going to try and just concentrate a nice bundle of fine shavings just at the base there, and those are going to be the ones I'm going to use to ignite it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to start my fire. So the way I tend to use these, and everyone's different and everyone has sort of their own technique, but the way I like to use them is I like to have a little flat space just in the base there from where I made all those small shavings. I have one sort of flat spot in the middle, hopefully you'll be able to see it there, just here. And the idea there is I can put my ferro rod in there and use that as a flat surface, a hard surface to press down on. Again, using the technique where I'm pressing down to direct my sparks, I can use that as my hard spot, and hopefully a couple of those sparks will be able to get it to light. Now of course you'll remember that I split this stick in half, and so I have two of these, and you wouldn't just make one feather stick ideally, you would make a couple of them. The idea being that when you get one going, you can place the other one on top. So I'll quickly knock up a second one. Okay, and then from here we should be able to see if we can get this going. So again, my ferro rod's just getting placed in the middle here. Helps me pin down the feather stick, and gives me a sturdy base. And all I'm doing is just striking sparks in the hope that these finer shavings I created will catch. And then, oh, the wind took that there. So as it catches, what you have to do is kind of pick the feather stick up, and of course the flame is going to want to rise. So the idea is you strike it flat, pick it up, the flame will rise and it will burn its way through all of these feathers, and then from there you can place your other one on top. So we'll just see if we can get that going again. Oh, there we go. And I'm allowing the flame to rise up through the feather. And then I can take my other feather stick and then place that on top. And then from there you'd have the good basis for a fire. Okay folks, so the last technique we're going to look at today, and my least favourite out of the five, although the five I'm mentioning here are my favourites. This is just the last sort of choice I would go for, but it's a really good one to know about, and I figured it would be worth covering in this video. And essentially what it is sort of an improvised fatwood. It takes two of the things we've looked at so far, making shavings and resin, sticking them together and making our own sort of fatwood. And I'm back at this tree here. I'm going to cut another nice long straight piece of wood off of it, again about the sort of length of my forearm, and that's where our shavings are going to come from. So I'll go and do that now. Okay, so just another fairly standard bit of wood there, nothing special. Again, a softwood, this is pine, and any other softwood would do the trick. And the next thing we're going to look at is finding some resin. So you'll remember earlier I was talking about those pine trees and how when they get damaged they'll produce resin to seal the cuts. That resin is the same resin that makes fatwood flammable, but we can find it on the outsides of trees where those trees have taken damage, and we can collect it and we can use it for our own fire lighting purposes. So let's go and see if we can find some of that and put it to good use. Okay, again, just a reminder of the tree we're looking for. This is Scots pine or Caledonian pine, and very, very plentiful in this area. And what we're looking for is one of them that appears to have been damaged, or perhaps has an unusual shape, or looks like it's been affected by disease or a fungus. Anything like that, any defects in the tree that might encourage it to produce resin to fill that cut. So I'm just going to walk through the woods here and see what I can find. Okay, so after a good bit of searching, I have found a tree that's obviously had a bit of a bad day. What's happened here is one of the branches has just been sheared off and it's left this exposed wood. This is just one big singular branch. The actual main trunk of the tree is behind here, and so there's still a living tree pumping resin into this, thinking that it's still a living branch and trying to heal itself. And so there's little droplets of resin scattered all around here, and all I need to do is just collect them. And the way I tend to like to do that is just to find a piece of bark. There's conveniently enough a few bits scattered around here that I can use. So just a little bit of bark like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and collect all these little droplets of resin. Now, some of them will be soft, some of them will be hard. Just depends on how fresh this injury is, the temperature, that sort of thing. And of course, the more resin you can get, the better your fire is going to be. The resin is the real fuel for the fire in this situation. On these bits of wood where the tree is fallen, I can use my knife and scrape along it and collect all of it. Probably the easiest way to collect a good amount of it. I'll show you guys. And then all I'm doing is just collecting a nice pile of this stuff. I don't really want to try and collect it in my hands because it's still very wet. Okay, so you can see I've got a nice pile there, and that's more than enough really to get our fire going. Okay, so much like we did with the fatwood before, what I'm going to do is take our stick we collected a wee while ago, just shave one side of it flat, like so. And then on a nice hard surface, I'm going to use my knife and I'm going to use it to scrape together some shavings. Okay, so I'm just collecting a little pile of shavings down the bottom there. Now I don't need lots here, I just need a little bit just to get the fire going. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my Ferro Rod to light these shavings, and then once the fire is going, I'm going to drop some of that resin into the flames, and the resin will get hot enough to start to burn. It will start to put off smoke, volatile smoke. That smoke will start to burn, and then from there the resin will be the main fuel of the fire. So just a little pile of shavings like that, and then get the Ferro Rod in the middle here. Put some sparks into it, just to get it going. There we go. And now I'm going to try and drop some of this resin onto it. Just try to make sure we've got a good fire there. And that's it. The resin goes up almost instantly. You can see all the black smoke here, and a fantastic way of getting a fire going. A little bit fiddly because you need to kind of find the materials, but an almost bomb-proof way of getting a fire going. You can see just how strong a flame that's producing. Hopefully you can see the black smoke coming off it as well. That tells you it's the resin that's doing the burning as opposed to the shavings. The shavings would have burnt out a long time ago without the resin in there. And normally what I would do is I would collect a huge pile of this resin. When I find it in trees like this, I make the most of it and I find as much as I can, and I save that for my emergency fire lighting. So there you have it. You can see the resin sizzling away there. Okay folks, so that's going to do it for today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been a really fun one to do. A lot of these techniques, although I use them quite often, I definitely use some more than others, and I think we've definitely started from the most simple, i.e. the grass, just collecting it as we go, putting a spark in it, to being job done, towards the end where you have to do more carving, you have to find individual materials, but these are all my favourite fire lighting methods. I know I could rely on any one of these to make a fire when needed, so well worth practicing. I mean, the resin one there, for instance, although I've shown it last, it's the one that's actually saved me before. There was one time where I got soaked in a canoe in Ireland, and we had no choice but to ditch ashore, very quickly set up a camp, strip down all of our clothes, and the only thing I had with me to get a fire going in the pouring rain and in the wind was a lump of resin. And as you've seen there, it works incredibly well. So it's very dependent on the situation you're in, and for beginner bushcrafters I would really encourage you to experiment with all of these. But even if you're a seasoned bushcrafter, I mean, I do this for a living, and it's really good to go back and practice them all and keep them sharp. And not only that, but try and improve upon them and make the most of them. Anyway, that's enough rambling from me. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Hopefully in some of the future episodes we'll be able to cover some of these techniques in more detail, because I've only really touched the surface on all of them. So if that's something you would like to see, then let me know. But thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I'll catch up with you all again soon.